"Get your black ass away from this entrance. This is for real people." The words cut through the cool October morning air like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Officer Marcus Webb stood blocking the courthouse's restricted entrance, his hand already moving toward the baton on his belt, his eyes fixed on the black woman in the tailored charcoal suit approaching with purposeful strides. She stopped, her leather briefcase held professionally in one hand, her expression neutral but her eyes alert. "Officer, I have business here. If you just—" "I don't care what business you think you have," Webb interrupted, stepping forward aggressively. His partner, Officer Derek Collins, moved to flank her from the right side. "This entrance is for judges, attorneys, court officials. Not for people like you." The woman, Dr. Amelia Richardson, kept her voice steady and calm despite the confrontation escalating in front of her. "I understand the entrance is restricted. I have proper authorization to—" "Authorization?" Webb's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Lady, I've worked this courthouse for 15 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. And you definitely don't belong." Marcus Webb was 46 years old, a courthouse security officer who'd spent the last decade working the night shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. He knew every corner of the building in darkness, every cleaning crew member, every maintenance schedule. But the daytime world, the judges, attorneys, clerks who arrived with the sun, was foreign territory he rarely encountered. This morning, Officer Martinez had called in sick with food poisoning, and Webb had been asked to cover the morning shift as an emergency replacement. He'd arrived tired and irritable, his usual routine disrupted, his patience already thin. And now this woman, dressed expensively but undeniably black, was trying to use the judge's private entrance like she owned the place. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from this entrance," Webb said, his voice rising loud enough that courthouse employees arriving for work began to slow, to watch, to pull out phones. "You need to go around to the public entrance like everyone else." Amelia set her briefcase down carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Officer, my name is Dr. Amelia Richardson. I'm scheduled to—" "I don't care what your name is," Webb interrupted again, his face reddening with anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Collins, help me remove this individual from the restricted area." Officer Collins hesitated for just a moment. Something about the woman's calm demeanor, her expensive suit, her complete lack of panic, suggested this wasn't a typical trespasser. But Webb was his senior partner, the man who'd shown him the ropes when he transferred to courthouse security 3 years ago. Collins moved forward. "Officer, please don't do this," Amelia said, her voice still calm but carrying a note of warning now. "If you'd simply verify my credentials." "Verify?" Webb grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into the fabric of her suit jacket. "I can verify that you're trespassing on restricted property. That's all I need to know." What happened next would be captured on 17 different cell phone cameras, uploaded to social media within minutes, and viewed by millions before the sun fully rose over the city. Webb and Collins seized Amelia Richardson by both arms and began dragging her backward across the concrete plaza in front of the courthouse. Her heels scraped against the ground as she struggled to maintain balance. Her briefcase fell, spilling documents across the pavement. Legal papers, case files, court schedules with official seals clearly visible. "Officer Webb, you're making a serious mistake," Amelia said, her voice still controlled despite the violence being inflicted on her body. "I'm asking you to stop and verify my identity before this becomes—" "Shut up," Webb snarled, pulling harder. "Collins, get her other arm. We're removing this trash from courthouse property." Amelia didn't fight back. She didn't scream or curse or struggle violently. She simply maintained her dignity with a quiet strength that made the assault even more disturbing to watch. Courthouse employees stood frozen in doorways, their morning coffee forgotten, their phones recording a scene that would define careers and destroy reputations. A young black attorney named Marcus Hayes watched from the steps, his stomach churning with recognition. He'd faced similar treatment at courthouses across the state. The assumptions, the suspicion, the immediate perception of threat based solely on skin color. But this woman carried herself with an authority he couldn't quite place. Webb and Collins dragged Amelia 30 feet from the entrance before finally releasing her arms. She stumbled slightly but caught herself, straightening her suit jacket with as much dignity as she could muster. "If I see you near this entrance again," Webb said, breathing heavily from exertion and adrenaline, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and obstruction. You understand me? Amelia looked at him for a long moment, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that should have given him pause. I understand perfectly, Officer Webb, and I want you to remember this moment. Remember how it felt to be absolutely certain you were right. Something in her tone, calm, measured, almost pitying, made Webb's confidence flicker for just a second. But the moment passed, replaced by renewed certainty that he'd just protected his courthouse from someone who clearly didn't belong. Collins, make sure she leaves the property, Webb ordered, turning back toward the entrance. I'm logging this incident as attempted unauthorized access to restricted areas. As Webb walked away, Amelia knelt to gather her scattered documents. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, but her mind was already calculating the legal and professional consequences of what had just occurred. Marcus Hayes, the young attorney, approached cautiously. Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need medical attention? Amelia looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. Not fear or anger, but a kind of cold certainty that justice was coming. I'm fine, thank you, she said, accepting his help gathering the papers. But I appreciate you asking. That's more courtesy than I received from the officers sworn to protect this courthouse. What they did was wrong, Marcus said quietly, glancing toward where Webb had disappeared. Completely wrong. I'm an attorney here. If you want to file a complaint. Oh, there will be complaints filed, Amelia assured him, a slight smile touching her lips. But not in the way you're thinking. She stood, brushing concrete dust from her suit, and checked her watch. 8:47 a.m. 13 minutes before she was scheduled to preside over the morning criminal docket in courtroom 3A. Excuse me, Amelia said to Marcus. I need to find an alternate entrance. I have a courtroom waiting for me. Marcus blinked in confusion. A courtroom? Are you representing a client this morning? Not exactly, Amelia replied, already moving toward the public entrance. I'm the judge. She walked away before his shock could fully register, leaving Marcus Hayes standing on the courthouse steps, mouth open, slowly realizing he'd just witnessed something that would change everything. Before we continue with what happens next, tell us, what time is it where you're watching this right now? And where are you tuning in from? Drop your city, country, and the current time in the comments below. Let's see how far this story about justice and accountability reaches across the world. Inside the courthouse, Amelia made her way through the public entrance, passing through metal detectors operated by security officers who had no idea what had just transpired outside. She took the elevator to the third floor, walked past her own chambers, and headed directly to the Chief Judge's office. Chief Judge Patricia Williams was reviewing the morning's docket when Amelia appeared in her doorway, her suit disheveled, her professional appearance compromised in ways that immediately alarmed the older woman. Amelia? My God, what happened to you? Amelia stepped inside and closed the door. I was just assaulted by courthouse security. Officers Marcus Webb and Derek Collins dragged me across the front plaza because I attempted to use the judge's entrance. Patricia's face went pale. They what? They physically removed me from courthouse property without asking for identification, without verifying my credentials, based entirely on their assumption that I don't belong here. Amelia's voice remained professional, but anger simmered beneath the surface. It was captured on multiple phones. It's probably already online. Patricia reached for her phone, already dialing. I'll have them suspended immediately. Terminated. This is completely unacceptable. No, Amelia said firmly. Not yet. Patricia paused, finger hovering over the screen. What do you mean, not yet? Amelia sat down carefully, wincing slightly from the rough treatment. I mean, we do this properly. Thoroughly. We don't just fire 2 officers and call it resolved. We expose the entire system that made them think this behavior was acceptable. Amelia, you're talking about? I'm talking about filing federal charges, Amelia interrupted calmly. Civil rights violations, assault under color of law, deprivation of constitutional rights. I want a full investigation into how many other people Webb and Collins have treated this way. I want their personnel files examined. I want every complaint that was ever filed against them reviewed. Patricia studied her newest judge carefully. Amelia Richardson had been appointed just 3 weeks earlier, confirmed after a distinguished career as a federal prosecutor. She tried over 200 cases, secured convictions against some of the state's most dangerous criminals, and never lost her composure under pressure. But this was different. This was personal. "Are you sure about this?" Patricia asked quietly. "Taking on courthouse security while you're still establishing yourself here could create complications." "I'm absolutely certain," Amelia replied. "Because if I don't challenge this now, I'm endorsing it. I'm telling every black attorney, every minority clerk, every person of color who enters this building that they can be assaulted without consequence as long as the person doing it wears a badge." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then we do it right. Full investigation, independent review, complete transparency. And I want to preside over my morning docket as scheduled," Amelia added. "I won't let what happened outside prevent me from doing my job inside." At 9 a.m., Judge Amelia Richardson entered courtroom 3A through the judicial chamber's entrance, wearing fresh robes over her damaged suit. The attorneys, defendants, and court staff rose respectfully as the bailiff announced her arrival. Marcus Hayes was in the gallery, having rushed inside to witness what he now knew would be extraordinary. He watched as Judge Richardson took her seat with perfect composure, as if she hadn't been dragged across concrete less than an hour earlier. "Good morning," Amelia said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "We have a full docket this morning, so let's proceed efficiently and professionally." She conducted the morning session with the same calm authority she'd maintained throughout the assault, ruling on motions, hearing pleas, setting trial dates. No one in the courtroom except Marcus knew what had happened outside. But they would. Soon everyone would know. Because at that very moment, security footage was being pulled by courthouse IT staff. Witness statements were being collected. And Officer Marcus Webb was about to learn that the woman he'd called trash and dragged across concrete held more power in this building than anyone except Chief Judge Williams herself. Webb had no idea that his 15-year career was over, that his pension was forfeit, that his name would become synonymous with the kind of institutional racism that hid behind badges and protocols. And he certainly had no idea that the woman he'd assaulted would be the one presiding over the legal proceedings that would destroy everything he'd built. 6 hours after the assault, Marcus Webb sat in Chief Judge Williams' office, still wearing his security uniform, still confident that he'd done his job correctly. Beside him sat his union representative, a man named Frank Morrison who defended officers through dozens of complaints over his 20-year career. Frank had assured Webb this would be routine, administrative leave during investigation, back to work within a week. But the atmosphere in Chief Judge Williams' office felt different. Heavier. More final. "Officer Webb," Patricia began, her voice carrying judicial authority, "do you understand why you've been called here?" Webb nodded confidently. "There was an incident this morning. A woman tried to access a restricted entrance. My partner and I removed her according to protocol." "According to protocol?" Patricia repeated slowly. "Can you describe this protocol?" "Yes, ma'am. When unauthorized individuals attempt to access restricted areas, we verify credentials. If they can't provide proper authorization, we escort them to appropriate public areas." "Did you ask this woman for credentials?" Webb hesitated for just a moment. She was acting suspicious, evasive. "In my 15 years of experience." "That's not what I asked, Officer Webb. Did you specifically request to see her identification or credentials?" Another pause, longer this time. "I explained that the entrance was restricted. She should have known to present proper identification." "So you never actually asked to see her ID?" "I followed standard security procedures, ma'am." Patricia opened a laptop on her desk, turning it so Webb could see the screen. "I'm going to show you something, Officer Webb. This is security footage from the front plaza camera." The video played in silence. Webb and Collins approaching Amelia. Webb grabbing her arm. The dragging, the scattered papers, Amelia's calm attempts to explain, Webb's visible aggression. "That woman," Patricia said quietly, "is Judge Amelia Richardson. She was appointed to this courthouse 3 weeks ago. She's a federal judge, Officer Webb. And you just assaulted her on camera in front of 17 witnesses." The color drained from Webb's face. That's not possible. She didn't look like." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "Didn't look like what, Officer Webb? Like a judge? What exactly does a judge look like in your professional opinion?" Webb's mouth opened and closed without sound. Frank Morrison, the union representative, cleared his throat. "Chief Judge Williams, My client was working an unfamiliar shift. He had no way of knowing. He had every way of knowing, Patricia interrupted. He could have asked for identification. He could have checked the daily roster. He could have called administration. Instead, he made assumptions based on appearance and assaulted a federal judge. She closed the laptop with a sharp click. Officer Webb, you're suspended without pay pending criminal investigation. Federal prosecutors will be reviewing this case for civil rights violations. And I'm recommending immediate termination. You can't do this, Webb said, panic creeping into his voice for the first time. I was protecting the courthouse. I've served here for 15 years without incident. Without incident? Patricia pulled out another folder. Officer Webb, we've been reviewing your personnel file. You have 7 formal complaints filed against you over the past 3 years. All from people of color. All dismissed by your supervisor without proper investigation. She spread the documents across her desk. Dr. Marcus Washington, prominent attorney, detained and questioned for 20 minutes in 2021. Maria Santos, court reporter for 8 years, stopped and interrogated about using the staff entrance she's accessed daily. Professor David Chin, expert witness, forced to provide 3 forms of ID before being allowed to attend a public hearing. Webb's face had gone from pale to ashen. Those were all legitimate security concerns. All of them were people of color, Officer Webb. And all of them were treated differently than white visitors to this courthouse. That's not security. That's discrimination. The meeting ended with Webb escorted from the building by officers from another jurisdiction, his badge and weapon confiscated, his career effectively over even before the criminal charges were filed. As he walked out through the public entrance, not the judge's entrance he'd guarded for so many years, Webb passed Judge Amelia Richardson entering for her afternoon session. She looked at him with the same calm, measured expression she'd maintained throughout the assault. No gloating, no anger, just quiet certainty that justice would be served. Officer Webb, she said simply, nodding as he passed. Webb couldn't meet her eyes. He'd spent 15 years confident in his authority, secure in his judgments, certain that his assumptions about who belonged where were justified by experience. Now in the span of 6 hours all of it was gone. And the worst part, the part that would haunt him through the trial, sentencing, and aftermath, was that he'd destroyed himself. Amelia Richardson hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to threaten or demand. She'd simply let him reveal exactly who he was, and then let the system he claimed to serve do what it was designed to do. Deliver justice. Without prejudice. Without regard to whether the perpetrator wore a badge or the victim wore robes. That evening, the video of Webb's assault on Judge Richardson had been viewed 4.3 million times across various platforms. #CourthouseJustice was trending nationally. Civil rights organizations were already mobilizing. And in her chambers, Judge Amelia Richardson sat reviewing the evidence that would be presented at Officer Marcus Webb's trial. A trial where she would not be the judge, having recused herself due to being the victim. But she would be the star witness. And this time, when she took the stand, everyone would know exactly who she was before she even opened her mouth. 3 months after the assault, the federal trial of United States versus Marcus Webb began in the same courthouse where Webb had worked for 15 years. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Media filled the gallery. Civil rights activists sat shoulder to shoulder with legal scholars. And in the front row sat 17 people who'd captured the assault on their phones, all of them subpoenaed as witnesses. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table in a civilian suit, looking diminished without his uniform. His attorney, David Thompson, was a seasoned defense lawyer who'd successfully defended dozens of officers accused of misconduct. But Thompson knew this case was different. The evidence was overwhelming. The victim was a federal judge. And worst of all, his client had given a series of interviews in the weeks after his suspension that had only made things worse. "I was just doing my job," Webb had told one reporter. If she'd acted like she belonged there, if she'd presented proper ID, none of this would have happened. The implication, that Amelia Richardson had somehow caused her own assault by not performing her credentials appropriately, had been torn apart by legal commentators and civil rights advocates. Now, as Judge Harold Martinez called the court to order, Webb would have to defend those statements under oath. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chin, a woman who'd built her career prosecuting civil rights violations. She approached the jury with the confidence of someone holding an unbeatable hand. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about power and accountability, Chin began. About what happens when someone with a badge decides that their assumptions matter more than another person's rights. She turned to face Webb, her gaze steady and cold. Officer Marcus Webb served in courthouse security for 15 years. He had authority to protect that building and everyone in it. But on October 12, he used that authority to assault a federal judge based solely on the color of her skin. Chin walked slowly past the jury box. The defendant will claim he was following protocol. He'll say he didn't know Judge Richardson's identity. He'll argue that he was just protecting courthouse security. She paused, letting the moment build. But the evidence will show that Officer Webb had every opportunity to verify Judge Richardson's identity. He chose not to. Instead, he made assumptions based on his 15 years of experience that taught him to see black people as threats regardless of how they're dressed, how they speak, or what credentials they carry. The opening statement continued, laying out the prosecution's case with systematic precision. Security footage. Witness testimony. Pattern evidence from Webb's previous complaints. Expert analysis of discriminatory policing. When Thompson rose for his opening, he looked like a man knowing he was fighting uphill. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Webb made a mistake. A serious mistake. But it was an honest error made during a chaotic morning shift he'd been asked to cover at the last minute. He's not a racist. He's a dedicated public servant who misjudged a situation and is now being made an example of. The argument felt hollow even as Thompson delivered it. How do you claim honest mistake when the defendant never bothered to ask for ID? How do you defend 15 years of similar behavior as coincidence? The trial would last 12 days, and by the end, Marcus Webb's defense would be destroyed not by the prosecution, but by his own words, his own pattern, his own inability to see what he'd become. On day 3 of the trial, Marcus Webb took the witness stand wearing a dark suit that didn't quite fit right, borrowed from his brother-in-law, since Webb could no longer afford the kind of clothes he'd worn when he had a steady paycheck and a pension to look forward to. His attorney, David Thompson, approached with practiced sympathy, ready to rehabilitate his client's image before the jury. Officer Webb, can you tell the court about your background in law enforcement? Webb straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim the confidence that had defined his career. I served in courthouse security for 15 years. Started on day shift, moved to nights about 10 years ago. I worked 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., protecting the building when most people were home with their families. And you took pride in that work? Yes, sir. Very much. I knew every corner of that courthouse, every protocol, every potential security threat. My job was to keep people safe, judges, staff, visitors. I took that responsibility seriously. Thompson nodded sympathetically. Now, on the morning of October 12th, you were working an unusual shift. Can you explain what happened? Webb leaned forward, warming to his story. Officer Martinez called in sick that morning. Food poisoning, I think. Anyway, I got called at 5:30 a.m. and asked to cover the morning shift as an emergency replacement. I'd only worked mornings maybe 5 times in my entire career. So you were working outside your normal routine. Exactly. The night shift is different. We deal with cleaning crews, maintenance people, emergency repairs. During the day there are lawyers, clerks, judges, lots of faces I don't know because I'm usually heading home when they're arriving. Thompson walked closer to the jury. Describe what you observed that morning around 6:45 a.m. Webb's voice took on the tone of someone explaining obvious logic to people who just didn't understand. I see this woman approaching the judge's entrance. That's a restricted access point, only for authorized judicial personnel. She's dressed professionally, I'll give her that. But something felt off. What felt off? In my experience, people who belong somewhere don't hesitate. They don't look around nervously. They walk with purpose like they own the place. This woman was acting evasive, uncertain. Thompson paused, letting the description settle. What did you do? I approached her professionally and explained that the entrance was restricted. I asked her to use the public entrance instead. And how did she respond? Webb shook his head as if still amazed by the audacity. She became defensive immediately. Started making demands, claiming she had business there. That's exactly what people say when they're trying to talk their way into places they don't belong. Did you ask to see her credentials? Webb hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I explained the entrance policy. She should have known to present proper courthouse identification if she actually worked there. So she didn't volunteer to show you ID? No, sir. She just kept insisting she belonged there, getting more agitated. Thompson walked back toward his table. What happened next? The situation was escalating. She was raising her voice, attracting attention from early arrivals. In my professional judgment, I needed backup. I called Officer Collins, my partner, and we made the decision to escort her to the public area where she could properly enter the building through normal channels. Escort, Thompson emphasized the word. Not arrest, not brutalize, but escort. That's correct. We used minimum necessary force to move a non-compliant individual from a restricted area to a public space. It's standard security protocol. Thompson returned to the defense table. Officer Webb, did you at any point intend to harm or humiliate this woman? Absolutely not. I was doing my job, protecting courthouse security, following established procedures. If I'd known she was a judge, of course I would have handled it differently. But she never identified herself. No further questions. The testimony had been delivered smoothly, Webb's confidence rebuilding with each answer. He'd painted himself as a dedicated officer following reasonable protocols, a victim of circumstances and miscommunication. But then Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chin stood for cross-examination, and everything changed. Chin approached the witness stand slowly, carrying a tablet and a folder thick with documents. She didn't speak immediately, just studied Webb with the kind of focused attention that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. Officer Webb, she began, her voice conversational but carrying an edge, you testified that you explained the entrance policy to Judge Richardson. What exactly did you say? Webb frowned. I told her the entrance was restricted. For authorized personnel only. Those exact words. The entrance is restricted for authorized personnel only? Something like that. I don't remember the exact phrasing. Really? Chin pulled up security footage on her tablet. Because we have audio from the courthouse security camera. Would you like me to play it for the jury? Webb's face tightened. I may have used different words, but the message was clear. The message was very clear, Officer Webb. What you actually said was, get your black ass away from this entrance. This is for real people. Those were your exact words, weren't they? The courtroom stirred. Several jurors sat up straighter. I was frustrated, Webb said defensively. It was early, I was tired, I may have used unprofessional language. Unprofessional? Or racist? Objection, Thompson called. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Martinez ruled. Rephrase, Ms. Chin. Chin nodded. Officer Webb, would you use that same language with a white woman approaching the entrance? I treat everyone the same. Do you? Let's test that claim. Chin approached the evidence table and retrieved a remote control. Your Honor, I'd like to present Prosecution Exhibit 7, security footage from the courthouse entrance over a 6-month period. The courtroom's display screen flickered to life. The first clip showed a timestamp from 4 months before the Richardson incident. A white woman in business casual attire approached the judge's entrance. Webb appeared on screen, smiling and friendly. Morning, ma'am. You need some help. I'm looking for Judge Bradley's chambers, the woman replied. Just through those doors, 2nd floor. Have a great day. No request for ID. No verification of credentials. Just a friendly greeting and directions. Chin clicked to the next clip. A white man in jeans and a t-shirt approached the same entrance. Hey there, buddy. This entrance is for staff only, but the public entrance is just around the corner. Can't miss it. Polite. Professional. No aggression. Third clip. A well-dressed black man carrying a briefcase. Webb's demeanor changed immediately. He stepped directly into the man's path, hand moving to his belt. Hold up. Where do you think you're going? I have a meeting with. I need to see some ID. This is a restricted area. The black man produced a bar license, driver's license, and business card. Webb examined each one for nearly 3 minutes while white visitors passed freely in the background. This says you're an attorney, but I've never seen you before. Who's your meeting with? Judge Patterson. I'm co-counsel on the Morrison case. Wait here while I verify that. The clip ended with the man waiting 15 minutes before finally being allowed entry. Chin played 6 more clips, the pattern becoming impossible to ignore. White visitors received courtesy and assistance. Black and Latino visitors received suspicion, lengthy ID checks, and interrogation. Officer Webb, you testified that you treat everyone the same. Does this footage support that testimony? Webb's jaw clenched. Those are isolated incidents taken out of context. Isolated? We have documentation of 43 similar interactions over 6 months. Shall I play all of them? That won't be necessary, Judge Martinez interjected. The pattern is established. Chin set down the remote. Officer Webb, you also testified that Judge Richardson was acting evasive. What specific behavior made you think that? She was looking around, hesitating. Looking around? She was approaching an entrance she'd never used before because her usual entry point was malfunctioning. Wouldn't most people look around to orient themselves? I've seen enough suspicious behavior to recognize it when. You've seen enough black people to assume they're suspicious, haven't you? Objection. Thompson was on his feet. Withdrawn, Chin said before the judge could rule. Let me ask this differently. In your 15 years of courthouse security, how many white people have you physically removed from the premises? Webb hesitated. I don't keep exact counts. I'll help you. According to your own incident reports, which we've subpoenaed, you've physically removed people from courthouse property 23 times in 15 years. How many of those people were white? Silence. The answer is 0, Officer Webb. 23 physical removals, all people of color. Does that seem like treating everyone the same? Each situation was different. Different how? Different skin color? Thompson objected again, but the damage was accumulating like stones building a wall Webb couldn't climb. Chin pulled out another document. Officer Webb, are you familiar with the term mandatory bias training? Yes. How many of those sessions have you attended in the past 5 years? Webb shifted in his seat. My shift makes it difficult to attend daytime trainings. That's not what I asked. How many sessions have you attended? I'm not sure. I am. You've attended 0 mandatory bias training sessions in 5 years. You've skipped all 17 sessions, claiming schedule conflicts. Yet during that same period, you attended every firearms training, every overtime certification seminar, and 3 professional development conferences. You somehow found time for those, didn't you? Those were job-related. Bias training isn't job-related for someone in security? Chin's voice carried disbelief. Someone whose job requires interacting with diverse populations every day? Webb had no answer. Chin changed direction. Let's talk about the morning of October 12th specifically. You testified that Judge Richardson became agitated and defensive. What did she actually say? She kept insisting she had business there. Did she raise her voice? She was getting louder. Did she raise her voice? Yes or no? She was speaking firmly. That's not what I asked. We have audio, Officer Webb. I can play it if you prefer. Did Judge Richardson raise her voice at any point during the encounter? Webb's shoulders sagged slightly. No. Did she use profanity? No. Did she threaten you in any way? No. Did she resist when you grabbed her arm? She pulled away initially. Did she fight back? Did she strike you, kick you, attempt to flee? No. So this woman, who spoke calmly, used no profanity, made no threats, and didn't physically resist, was the one escalating the situation? Not you, the officer who called her a black ass and grabbed her without asking for identification. Thompson objected again, but Chin had made her point. The jury was seeing Webb's story crumble under the weight of his own contradictions. If you can't stand officers like Marcus Webb who hide racism behind badges and protocol, hit that subscribe button right now. Only those who defend discriminatory cops won't engage. Show that authority without accountability is just another form of oppression. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution systematically demolished Webb's credibility through a parade of witnesses who'd experienced identical treatment. Dr. Marcus Washington, a distinguished civil rights attorney with 30 years of experience, took the stand wearing the same confident bearing that had been challenged by Webb years earlier. Dr. Washington, can you describe your interaction with Officer Webb in March of last year? Marcus Washington's voice carried the dignity of someone who'd fought these battles his entire career. I was entering the courthouse to argue a motion before Judge Patterson. I've practiced law in this building for 15 years. Officer Webb stopped me at the judge's entrance and demanded identification. Did you provide it? I showed him my bar license, driver's license, and the case file I was carrying with the court's official seal clearly visible. He examined each document for several minutes while multiple white attorneys walked past without being questioned. How did that make you feel? Washington's expression hardened. Humiliated. Angry. I'm a partner at one of the most respected firms in the state. I was a federal prosecutor for 12 years. And I was being treated like a criminal for the simple act of entering a building where I've worked for over a decade. Chin nodded. Did you file a complaint? Yes. It was dismissed by Sergeant Morrison after what he called a thorough investigation that consisted of asking Webb if he'd done anything wrong and accepting his denial as fact. The pattern continued with Maria Santos, a court reporter who'd worked at the courthouse for 8 years. Officer Webb stopped me at the staff entrance. I've used every single working day for 8 years, Maria testified, her voice shaking with residual anger. He demanded to know why I was using a restricted entrance as if I was trespassing in my own workplace. Meanwhile, 3 white court clerks walked past without being questioned. Did you explain that you worked there? I showed him my courthouse ID badge, my staff parking permit, and offered to call my supervisor. He still made me wait 20 minutes while he verified my employment. I was late to a deposition because of the delay. Professor David Chin, an expert witness who testified in dozens of trials, described being forced to provide 3 forms of identification before being allowed to attend a public hearing, something never required of the white observers who entered freely. Each witness told the same story: suspicion, delay, humiliation, and complaints that disappeared into a system designed to protect officers rather than citizens. But the most damaging testimony came from Webb's own supervisor. Sergeant Frank Morrison took the stand looking uncomfortable, knowing his own career hung in the balance. Chin approached him like a prosecutor who'd already won but wanted to savor the victory. Sergeant Morrison, how many formal complaints were filed against Officer Webb during your time as his supervisor? Morrison cleared his throat. 7, I believe. 7 complaints in 3 years. And how were they resolved? Each was investigated according to department protocol. Protocol that involves you, Webb's friend of 12 years, asking him if he did anything wrong and accepting his explanation? I conducted thorough interviews. Did you interview any of the complainants? Silence. Did you review security footage? More silence. Did you consult with courthouse administration about whether Webb's actions aligned with actual policy? The complaints were unsubstantiated, Morrison said defensively. Chin pulled out a thick folder. All 7 complainants were people of color. All 7 described treatment identical to what Judge Richardson experienced. And all 7 complaints were dismissed within 48 hours. That's not investigation, Sergeant Morrison. That's cover-up. The prosecution's final piece of evidence was a statistical analysis prepared by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an expert in discriminatory policing patterns. Dr. Rodriguez presented data that was damning in its clarity. Officer Webb stopped and questioned people of color at a rate 13 times higher than white visitors. He requested identification from minorities 89% of the time, compared to 3% for white individuals. Physical confrontations occurred exclusively with people of color, 23 incidents over 15 years, 0 involving white visitors. She displayed charts and graphs that made the pattern undeniable. The probability of this occurring without racial bias is approximately 0.00001%. Statistically, it's virtually impossible that Officer Webb wasn't specifically targeting people based on race. By the end of the evidence phase, Webb's defense had been reduced to rubble. Thompson tried to rehabilitate his client during redirect examination, but there was no repairing what had been exposed. The courtroom had seen the videos, heard the victims, examined the statistics. Marcus Webb wasn't a dedicated officer making honest mistakes. He was a racist who'd used his badge to terrorize people of color for 15 years while a broken system protected him. But the prosecution had saved one final revelation for maximum impact. On day 8 of the trial, Judge Amelia Richardson was called to testify. She entered the courtroom wearing a tailored navy suit, her bearing regal and composed. Every person in the gallery understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, a federal judge taking the stand as a victim in a civil rights case. Chin approached her with visible respect. Please state your name and occupation for the record. Amelia Catherine Richardson. I'm a federal district judge for the Northern District, assigned to this courthouse. Judge Richardson, can you describe your background prior to your judicial appointment? Amelia's voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms. I was a federal prosecutor for 15 years. I tried over 200 cases, specializing in civil rights violations, hate crimes, and police misconduct. I had a conviction rate of 97%. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Webb had assaulted one of the country's leading prosecutors of police misconduct. Can you tell the court about the morning of October 12th? Amelia's testimony was precise and devastating. She described arriving early to review her case files, finding her usual entrance malfunctioning, approaching the alternative entrance that was specifically designated for judicial personnel. Officer Webb approached me with immediate hostility, Amelia said, her voice remaining calm despite describing the assault. Before I could explain my presence, he made degrading assumptions about why I was there. His language was not just unprofessional, it was deliberately dehumanizing. Can you be specific about the language he used? He told me to get my black ass away from the entrance. He said it was for real people, implying that I wasn't. When I attempted to explain that I had business there, he called me trash and ordered Officer Collins to help remove me. Chin walked closer. Did Officer Webb ask to see your identification at any point? Never. He made his decision about who I was and whether I belonged based entirely on looking at me. When I tried to show him my judicial credentials, he grabbed my arm before I could retrieve them from my briefcase. What happened next? Amelia's composure never wavered, but pain flickered in her eyes. Officers Webb and Collins seized both my arms and dragged me backward across the concrete plaza. My briefcase fell, scattering confidential court documents across the ground. I maintained my composure and asked them repeatedly to verify my credentials before the situation escalated further. They refused. Did you resist? No. I'm a federal judge and former prosecutor. I understand that resisting police, even when they're violating my rights, would only make the situation worse. I maintained my dignity and documented everything mentally for the legal proceedings I knew would follow. Chin paused, letting the image settle. Judge Richardson, why didn't you simply tell them you were a judge? Amelia looked directly at the jury, and her answer would be quoted in law journals and civil rights seminars for years to come. Because I shouldn't have to prove my worth to exist in a public building. Officer Webb's behavior should be judged on its merits, not on whether his victim turned out to be powerful enough to fight back. Every person deserves dignity regardless of their title or position. She turned to look at Webb, who couldn't meet her gaze. If I'd been a clerk, a secretary, a civilian visitor, would my assault have been acceptable? Officer Webb violated my rights and the rights of everyone he's targeted based on skin color. My judicial title makes this case visible, but it doesn't make the crime more serious. It was always serious. We just usually don't hear about it because the victims don't have the power to demand accountability. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as Amelia's words hung in the air like a benediction. Chin had no further questions. The truth had been spoken with perfect clarity. Thompson's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. How do you challenge a federal judge with 15 years of prosecutorial experience who just described a crime that was captured on 17 different cameras? As Amelia left the witness stand, she walked past Webb's table with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the assault. She didn't glare, didn't gloat, didn't need to. Her testimony had accomplished what she'd intended from the moment Webb grabbed her arm. It had exposed not just one officer's racism, but an entire system's willingness to protect discriminatory behavior until it became too visible to ignore. The trial would continue for 4 more days, but everyone in the courtroom already knew the outcome. Marcus Webb's 15-year career, his pension, his freedom, his reputation, all of it was over. And the woman he'd called trash had destroyed him simply by telling the truth. Comment: dignity matters. If you believe Judge Richardson's response, maintaining composure and demanding systemic change, is more powerful than any revenge. Let's show that justice through the system defeats racism better than violence. Only those who excuse discrimination stay silent. On day 12 of the trial, the courtroom felt different. Heavier. Everyone present understood they were witnessing the final chapter of Marcus Webb's story, and the first chapter of something larger, a reckoning that would reshape courthouse security across the nation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chin rose for closing arguments, carrying no notes, no exhibits. She'd memorized every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every damning statistic. Now she would weave them into a narrative that would leave the jury no choice but conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chin began, her voice carrying the weight of not just this case but centuries of injustice it represented, "over the past 12 days, you've witnessed something extraordinary. Not because a police officer committed a crime, that happens far too often, but because this time the victim had the power to demand accountability." She walked slowly past the jury box, making eye contact with each member. "Judge Amelia Richardson is a federal judge, a former prosecutor who put away some of this state's most dangerous criminals. She has credentials, authority, respect. And yet Officer Marcus Webb saw none of that. What did he see? A black woman. And in his 15 years of experience, that was all he needed to see." Chin turned to face Webb, who sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. "The defense wants you to believe this was an honest mistake. A misunderstanding. A dedicated officer following protocol on an unfamiliar shift. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence tells us this wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern." She began counting on her fingers. 43 documented incidents of Webb stopping people of color at 13 times the rate of white visitors. 23 physical removals, all involving minorities, 0 involving white people. 7 formal complaints, all from people of color, all dismissed without real investigation. Her voice grew stronger. Dr. Marcus Washington, treated like a criminal despite being a respected attorney. Maria Santos, interrogated in her own workplace after 8 years of service. Professor David Chin, forced to provide 3 forms of ID while white observers walked past freely. And finally, Judge Amelia Richardson, dragged across concrete and called trash, while attempting to enter her own courthouse. Chin walked back to the jury, her voice dropping to something quieter but more intense. "This isn't about one bad morning. This is about a system that enabled, protected, and rewarded racist behavior for 15 years. A system where complaints disappeared, where supervisors covered for friends, where badges became licenses to terrorize people based on skin color." She paused, letting the silence build. Officer Webb had every opportunity to verify Judge Richardson's identity. He could have asked for credentials. He could have checked the daily roster. He could have called administration. Instead, he grabbed her, called her racial slurs, and physically assaulted her because in his mind, black women don't belong in positions of authority. Chin's voice took on steel. The defendant violated Judge Richardson's constitutional rights. He committed assault under color of law. He deprived her of due process. And he did all of this while wearing a badge that's supposed to represent justice, equality, protection. She turned to face the gallery, addressing the 17 people who'd captured the assault on their phones. "You saw it happen. You recorded it. You bear witness to the moment when Marcus Webb's 15 years of discriminatory policing finally became visible to the world." Returning to the jury, Chin delivered her conclusion. "Judge Richardson said something during her testimony that I want you to remember. She said she shouldn't have to prove her worth to exist in a public building. That every person deserves dignity regardless of title or position. She's right. Whether Officer Webb assaulted a judge or a janitor, a prosecutor or a probation officer, the crime is the same. The violation is identical. But because his victim was powerful enough to fight back, we're here today. Because she refused to let this disappear like the 42 incidents before hers, Marcus Webb finally faces consequences." Chin's voice rang with moral authority. "Find him guilty. Send the message that badges don't grant immunity from the Constitution. Show that our justice system protects everyone, especially when the protectors become the violators. Hold Marcus Webb accountable for 15 years of systematic racism hiding behind a uniform." She returned to her seat, and the courtroom sat in heavy silence. After a brief recess, David Thompson rose for the defense's closing argument. He looked like a man who knew he was fighting a battle already lost but was obligated to keep swinging anyway. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client made a mistake. A serious, regrettable mistake. Officer Webb should have asked for identification. He should have verified Judge Richardson's credentials. He acknowledges that now. Thompson's voice lacked the conviction of Chen's. But making a mistake doesn't make someone a criminal. Officer Webb served this courthouse faithfully for 15 years. He worked nights, weekends, holidays, shifts when most people are home with their families. He protected that building and everyone in it. The argument felt hollow against the mountain of evidence presented over 12 days. Yes, there were complaints. But in 15 years of security work, some complaints are inevitable. People get frustrated when denied access. They file grievances. That doesn't make Officer Webb a racist. Thompson gestured weakly toward the evidence table. The prosecution showed you videos of other incidents, but they took them out of context. Security work requires making quick judgments about potential threats. Sometimes those judgments are wrong. He paused, searching for something persuasive to say. Officer Webb is a husband, a father of 2 daughters, a man who served his community for over a decade. One error in judgment, made during an unfamiliar shift under stressful circumstances, shouldn't destroy his entire life. The plea for mercy fell flat. The jury had seen too much, heard too many victims, examined too many statistics showing pattern rather than mistake. We ask you to consider the totality of Officer Webb's career, not just one morning. We ask you to remember that good people sometimes make terrible mistakes. And we ask you to show the kind of mercy that Judge Richardson, despite her grace and dignity, has not extended to my client. Thompson sat down and everyone in the courtroom understood the defense had failed. Not because Thompson was incompetent, but because no argument could overcome the truth the evidence had revealed. Judge Martinez provided final instructions to the jury, explaining the legal standards for civil rights violations, assault under color of law, and deprivation of constitutional rights. His voice carried the gravity of someone who understood this verdict would echo far beyond this courtroom. The jury retired to deliberate at 3:47 p.m. They returned with a verdict at 4:52 p.m., just 65 minutes later. The speed sent a clear message. This hadn't been difficult. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was undeniable. Marcus Webb's guilt was beyond any reasonable doubt. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Martinez asked. The forewoman, a middle-aged black woman who'd been taking meticulous notes throughout the trial, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, how do you find? Guilty. Webb's shoulders sagged. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, but there was no comfort to offer. On the charge of assault and battery under color of law, how do you find? Guilty. Webb's wife, sitting in the gallery, began crying quietly. Their 2 daughters, teenagers who'd attended every day of the trial hoping for vindication, stared at their father with expressions mixing disbelief and shame. On the charge of conspiracy to deprive constitutional rights, how do you find? Guilty. 3 guilty verdicts. Federal crimes carrying serious prison time. Judge Martinez polled the jury individually, each member confirming their vote. 12 voices, unanimous in their certainty that Marcus Webb had violated his oath, betrayed his badge, and used his authority to terrorize people based on skin color. As the jury was dismissed with the court's thanks, Webb sat motionless at the defense table, the reality settling over him like concrete hardening. 15 years of career, gone. His pension forfeited. His freedom about to be taken. His reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of redemption. Judge Martinez set sentencing for 2 weeks later, denying bail. Webb would await sentencing in federal custody, giving him time to contemplate how his assumptions about a black woman's worth had cost him everything. As marshals led Webb away in handcuffs, he passed Judge Amelia Richardson sitting in the gallery. She looked at him with the same calm, measured expression she'd maintained since he first grabbed her arm months earlier. No triumph. No gloating. Just quiet certainty that justice had been served. Hit subscribe if you believe officers like Marcus Webb deserve prison time, not just termination for systematic civil rights violations. Show that badges don't protect those who abuse their authority. Only people who defend racist cops won't engage. Sentencing day arrived on a cold November morning. The same courtroom now packed even more tightly with media, civil rights advocates, and the 17 people whose phone videos had made this accountability possible. Marcus Webb stood before Judge Martinez wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, looking 20 years older than he had at the start of the trial. 2 weeks in federal detention had stripped away his last remnants of confidence. Judge Martinez reviewed the pre-sentencing report with visible gravity. "Mr. Webb, I've examined your entire career history, the psychological evaluation, the victim impact statements, and I've reached some conclusions about your character and conduct." Webb's attorney had filed desperate motions for leniency, citing Webb's family, his years of service, the financial hardship imprisonment would cause. All of them had been denied. "You served in courthouse security for 15 years, Judge Martinez continued. "During that time, you systematically targeted people of color. 43 documented incidents, 23 physical confrontations, 7 formal complaints that were buried by supervisors more interested in protecting you than protecting citizens." The judge's voice grew harder. "But those numbers don't capture the full scope of harm you caused. How many people avoided this courthouse because they feared treatment like Dr. Washington received? How many young attorneys of color doubted their abilities because you made them feel unwelcome? How many victims never filed complaints because previous complaints disappeared into a system designed to protect officers like you?" Webb stood with his head bowed, unable to meet the judge's eyes. "Your assault on Judge Richardson was captured on video and witnessed by dozens of people. But it wasn't an aberration. It was the moment your pattern became too visible to ignore. You called a federal judge trash. You physically assaulted her. And worst of all, you did it with absolute confidence that you'd face no consequences because you'd never faced consequences before." Judge Martinez paused, letting the weight settle. "The pre-sentencing report recommends 18 months. The prosecution requests 5 years. Your attorney asks for probation and community service." Webb's wife gripped their daughter's hands tightly, hoping for mercy. "I've sentenced hundreds of people in this courtroom," the judge said. "And I've learned that the worst crimes aren't always the most violent. Sometimes the worst crimes are the ones committed by people sworn to protect us. People who use their authority to oppress rather than serve." His voice rang with judicial authority. "Marcus Webb, you violated your oath. You betrayed the badge. You systematically terrorized people based on race while hiding behind the legitimacy of law enforcement. The damage you caused extends far beyond Judge Richardson, and the sentence must reflect that." Webb's knees buckled slightly. The marshals on either side steadied him. "You are hereby sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from law enforcement, security work, or any position of public authority. You will complete 500 hours of community service with civil rights organizations upon release. And you will forfeit all pension benefits accrued during your employment." The sentence hit Webb like physical blows. 4 years in prison. No pension, the retirement he'd counted on, that he'd earned through 15 years of service, gone. Permanently barred from the only career he'd ever known. "Additionally," Judge Martinez continued, "this courthouse will implement the Richardson Protocol, comprehensive reforms to prevent the kind of systematic discrimination you perpetrated for 15 years. He turned to address the full courtroom. "Independent oversight of all security complaints. Mandatory quarterly bias training for all personnel. Body cameras for all security officers. Zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. And most importantly, an easy-to-access system for anyone who feels they've been targeted to file complaints that will actually be investigated." The judge looked back at Webb. "Your 15 years of racism hiding behind a badge are over." And because Judge Richardson had the courage to demand accountability rather than accepting settlement money and signing an NDA, the system that protected you is being dismantled. As marshals led Webb away to begin his 4-year sentence, he looked back one final time at his wife and daughters. They weren't crying anymore. They were staring at him with expressions of disappointment and shame that hurt worse than any prison sentence. The man who'd spent 15 years certain of his authority, confident in his judgments, protected by a broken system, was being led away to federal prison by officers who now treated him the way he treated people of color for years, with suspicion, with minimal courtesy, with the assumption that he deserved whatever happened to him. The irony was perfect and devastating. 6 months after sentencing, the transformation was remarkable. The Richardson Protocol had been implemented not just at the courthouse where Webb worked, but at federal courthouses nationwide. What started as one judge's demand for accountability had become the blueprint for reforming courthouse security across America. Independent civilian oversight boards now reviewed all discrimination complaints. No more internal investigations where supervisors protected friends. Every complaint was examined by a panel that included civil rights attorneys, community members, and victims' advocates. Mandatory bias training occurred quarterly, designed and evaluated by external experts rather than law enforcement agencies protecting their own. Attendance wasn't optional. Missing a session meant immediate suspension pending review. Body cameras became standard equipment for all courthouse security personnel. The footage was retained for 2 years and could be subpoenaed in any complaint. The number of discriminatory incidents dropped by 78% in the first 6 months, not because discrimination disappeared, but because officers knew they were being watched. Most importantly, the numbers showed real change. Complaints filed by people of color increased by 43%, not because discrimination was rising, but because victims finally believed their voices would be heard. Investigation rates jumped from 12% to 91%. Sustained complaints resulting in discipline went from 8% to 76%. Marcus Webb served his sentence at a medium-security federal prison in Pennsylvania, far from the courthouse he'd once controlled. His days were spent in food service, cleaning industrial kitchens for 17 cents per hour, taking orders from corrections officers who treated him with the same casual dismissal he'd shown to people he considered beneath him. His wife divorced him after 8 months, taking their daughters and moving to Oregon to escape the shame of being associated with his name. His friends stopped visiting after the 2nd month. His former colleagues from courthouse security never came at all. Webb had plenty of time to think about the choices that had led him here. The assumptions. The prejudices. The 15 years of treating people as threats based solely on skin color. But even in prison, even facing the destruction of everything he'd built, genuine remorse eluded him. In letters to the parole board, Webb wrote about his regret for the incident and the misunderstanding, language that suggested he still didn't grasp that he'd committed systematic civil rights violations for over a decade. He was sorry for the consequences he faced, but not for the harm he'd caused. The parole board denied his request for early release. Meanwhile, Judge Amelia Richardson's influence extended far beyond courthouse security protocols. She'd been appointed to the Federal Civil Rights Commission, where she advocated for systematic reforms in law enforcement, criminal justice, and institutional racism. Her legal scholarship on implicit bias in security settings was studied in law schools nationwide. But perhaps most importantly, her story had changed how people thought about power, dignity, and who deserves respect. The leather briefcase she'd been carrying that morning, the one that fell when Webb grabbed her, scattering court documents across concrete, now sat in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The placard beside it read, "This briefcase belonged to Federal Judge Amelia Richardson when she was assaulted by courthouse security officer Marcus Webb on October 12, 2023. Judge Richardson's refusal to accept silent settlement and her demand for public accountability led to the Richardson Protocol, reforming courthouse security nationwide. Her dignity under assault and commitment to systemic change rather than personal revenge exemplifies the ongoing struggle for civil rights in American institutions." Visitors stood before the exhibit, reading about how one woman's calm response to racist violence had created ripples of change across the entire federal court system. Children asked their parents why the judge didn't fight back. The parents explained that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't violence. It's refusing to let the system bury the truth. Comment, the Richardson Protocol matters. If you believe Judge Richardson's focus on systemic change instead of just punishing Webb is what real justice looks like. Let's show that reform protecting future victims matters more than revenge. Only those who prefer individual punishment over systemic change stay silent. 3 years after the assault, Judge Amelia Richardson sat in her chambers reviewing a case that had been brought under the very protocols her experience had created. A young Latina attorney named Isabella Martinez had filed a complaint about being stopped and questioned by courthouse security despite displaying proper credentials. The complaint had been investigated within 72 hours by an independent review board. The security officer who targeted her had been suspended pending bias retraining. Isabella's complaint wouldn't disappear into a supervisor's desk drawer. It wouldn't be dismissed without investigation. And she wouldn't be pressured to sign an NDA and accept settlement money in exchange for silence. Because of what happened to Judge Richardson, Isabella had a system that actually protected her. That afternoon, Amelia spoke at a law school graduation, addressing future attorneys who would navigate a justice system still struggling with its own prejudices. 3 years ago, I was assaulted by a courthouse security officer who saw my skin color and decided I didn't belong in a building where I'd been appointed to serve justice, Amelia told the graduates. He grabbed me, dragged me across concrete, called me trash. And he did it with absolute confidence that he'd face no consequences. The graduates listened with rapt attention. I could have accepted a settlement, signed an NDA, moved on quietly. That's what 42 other victims before me had done. But I chose accountability. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the next person, the next Dr. Washington, the next Maria Santos, the next Isabella Martinez, to have a system that actually protected them. Her voice grew stronger. Marcus Webb is in prison. His career is over. His pension is gone. But that's not what matters most. What matters is that his pattern of discrimination exposed a broken system. And fixing that system protects thousands of people who'll never know my name. She looked across the sea of young faces, many of them people of color who would face their own Marcus Webbs in courtrooms, police stations, and government buildings across America. You'll encounter people who judge you by your appearance rather than your credentials, who assume you don't belong because of your skin color, your accent, your name. You'll be tested. And in those moments, you'll have to choose between accepting injustice quietly or demanding accountability publicly. Amelia's voice carried the weight of experience. Choose accountability. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Because individual justice is satisfying, but systemic change is lasting. The graduates erupted in applause. That evening, Amelia returned to the courthouse where it had all begun. She walked through the judge's entrance, the same entrance Webb had blocked 3 years earlier, and was greeted by security officers who'd completed the Richardson Protocol training. "Good evening, Judge Richardson," the officer said respectfully, recognizing her immediately and stepping aside without hesitation. The difference was tangible. What had once been a space where people of color had to prove their worthiness was now a space where dignity was presumed rather than earned. Amelia thought about Marcus Webb, now in year 3 of his 4-year sentence, working prison jobs for pennies, his name synonymous with everything wrong with discriminatory policing. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering. His imprisonment didn't undo the harm he'd caused to Dr. Washington, Maria Santos, Professor Chin, or the dozens of others who'd faced his prejudice. But his accountability had created something larger than punishment. It had created change. Real, measurable, lasting change in how courthouse security operated nationwide. And that, Amelia knew, was worth more than any individual revenge. 5 years after the assault, Marcus Webb was released from federal prison after serving his full sentence. No early parole, no time reduced for good behavior. For years, every day of it, he emerged into a world that had moved on without him. His ex-wife had remarried. His daughters, now in college, had changed their last names to avoid association with his. His former colleagues from courthouse security refused to return his calls. Webb found work at a shopping mall security company, making $12 an hour checking receipts and watching for shoplifters. The man who'd once controlled access to a federal courthouse now asked teenagers to empty their pockets if they looked suspicious. The irony followed him everywhere. He still made assumptions based on appearance. He still stopped Black and Latino teenagers more often than white ones. But now he had no authority, no badge, no system protecting him. And when a supervisor noticed the pattern and fired him after 3 months, Webb had no recourse. No union representation. No internal investigation that would dismiss the complaint. Just immediate termination and a notation in his employment file that made him virtually unemployable. Webb moved from job to job, each one worse than the last. Overnight janitor. Parking lot attendant. Finally, delivering food for a gig economy app, accepting orders through his phone from people who didn't know his name or his history. Sometimes, while waiting for orders at restaurants, Webb would see news coverage of Judge Richardson. Another awards ceremony. Another speech about civil rights. Another courthouse implementing the Richardson Protocol. And he'd remember the moment he'd grabbed her arm, absolutely certain he was right. Certain she didn't belong. Certain his 15 years of experience justified his assumptions. That certainty had cost him everything. And unlike the 42 victims before Judge Richardson, he'd gotten exactly what he deserved. Tap like if this story proves that accountability for systematic racism requires both individual punishment and institutional reform. show that we need both Marcus Webb's in prison and Richardson protocols protecting future victims. Only those who accept the status quo scroll past without engaging. 10 years after the assault that changed courthouse security nationwide, Judge Amelia Richardson stood before the Smithsonian exhibit featuring her briefcase, speaking to a group of law students on a field trip. "That morning changed my life," she told them, gesturing to the leather case behind protective glass. "But more importantly, it changed thousands of other lives. People who now enter courthouses without fear of being targeted based on skin color. People whose complaints are actually investigated. People who know that badges don't grant immunity from the Constitution." A young black student raised her hand. "Judge Richardson, do you ever regret not just taking a settlement and moving on? Was all of this worth the public scrutiny and the stress of the trial?" Amelia smiled gently. "Every single day of that trial was worth it if it meant the next generation, your generation, faces fewer Marcus Webbs. Personal peace isn't worth systematic injustice continuing unchecked." Another student asked, "What happened to Officer Webb?" "He served 4 years in federal prison. Lost his pension, his family, his career. He works delivering food now, I believe. Do you feel sorry for him?" Amelia considered the question carefully. "I feel sorry that he spent 15 years harboring prejudices that destroyed his life. But I don't regret his accountability. Actions have consequences. And his actions harmed too many people for too long." The students filed past the exhibit, reading about how one woman's refusal to stay silent had created the Richardson Protocol, reformed courthouse security in 47 states, and changed how America thought about bias in law enforcement. As Amelia left the museum, she reflected on the journey from that October morning to this moment. The assault, the trial, the verdict, the protocols, the lasting change. Marcus Webb had seen a black woman and assumed she was nothing. That assumption had destroyed him and reformed a system. Sometimes, Amelia knew, justice required judges to seek justice for themselves. Not because they were special, but because they had the power to ensure the system worked for everyone who came after them. And that was the difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge satisfies the individual. Accountability transforms the system. Judge Amelia Richardson had chosen transformation. And the Richardson Protocol, implemented in courthouses across America, would protect people for generations, long after both she and Marcus Webb were gone. The briefcase sat in its glass case, a permanent reminder that dignity denied to anyone diminishes dignity for everyone. And that sometimes the most powerful response to racism isn't violence or silence, but the patient, systematic pursuit of justice that changes the rules for everyone who comes next. This has been a story from Blissful Whispers, where we share narratives proving that individual courage can create systemic change, that maintaining dignity under assault is more powerful than retaliation, and that accountability, real accountability, requires both punishing perpetrators and reforming the systems that enable them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that badges don't grant immunity from the Constitution, that assumptions based on appearance destroy lives, and that one person's refusal to stay silent can protect thousands of others, share it with someone who needs to hear that justice is possible even when the system seems broken. Because Judge Richardson's story, of being assaulted by the very people sworn to protect the courthouse where she served, is not unique. It happens to Black attorneys, Latino clerks, Asian professionals, and countless others who navigate systems that presume them guilty, suspicious, or out of place based on nothing but appearance. Subscribe to Blissful Whispers for more stories proving that systematic racism requires systematic accountability, that changing broken systems matters more than punishing individual racists, and that the distance between humiliation and transformation is sometimes just one person brave enough to demand justice publicly rather than accepting silence privately. Where are you in your journey? Have you witnessed discrimination hiding behind protocol and procedure? Have you stayed silent when you should have spoken up, or spoken up when it cost you something? Drop your thoughts in the comments because your story matters too. This has been Blissful Whispers, where we don't just tell stories of injustice, we document the victories that come when people refuse to let those injustices disappear into settlements and NDAs. Thank you for witnessing Judge Richardson's transformation of pain into protection, of assault into accountability, of individual suffering into systemic reform that will shield generations of people from officers like Marcus Webb. At Blissful Whispers, we believe the most powerful stories are those that strip away comfortable lies and reveal uncomfortable truths. that racism hides behind badges, that systems protect powerful people until victims become too powerful to silence, and that real change requires both punishing individuals and dismantling the structures that enabled their cruelty. If today's story challenged your perspective about law enforcement accountability, about who deserves dignity in public spaces, about whether individual punishment or systemic reform matters more, click subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the voices demanding that justice work for everyone, not just those with titles and power. Because sometimes the greatest gift isn't avoiding assault. It's using that assault to ensure the next person doesn't face the same fate. That's not just survival. That's transformation. This has been Blissful Whispers, where every voice matters, where every story counts, where truth speaks louder than badges and accountability transforms more than any amount of silence ever could.